So why don't we just start with an introduction? Why don't you tell us who you are, um, your name, and however you describe yourself professionally.
My name is Taylor Keeland, and I am an author and ghostwriter. And I have just released a book today called Unwavering: The Wives Who Fought to Ensure No Man is Left Behind.
And you had a co-author on that book as well?
Co author, her name is Judy Silverstein Gray.
Hmm. And if you had to, if you had to peg the themes of this book to something that is more current, maybe something that's in the news today, is there a phenomenon or an occurrence or a news event that you can think of that really hooks directly into the themes of your book?
There are two. If you recall, when we exited Afghanistan in, I think it was 2019, uh, it was no accident that we left no man behind. We left that country with no American POWs and no missing men. It was no accident. We now expend tremendous resources. In fact, we have a government agency in this country with 700 professionals and an annual budget of $130 million to comb the globe annually to search for all remains. And when we do have a captive or a POW, we expend tremendous resources to try and rescue that person. All you have to do is look at the case of Bo Bergdahl, who walked off his post in Afghanistan and was captured by the Taliban. And we deployed incredible special forces resources to try and find him and rescue him. And we eventually traded 5 ardent terrorists for him. That never happened before the Vietnam War. And we have a handful of military wives from the 1960s to thank for that. We say that we leave no man behind, but that really has only been the case since the Vietnam War. And that's what this book is about.
And do you have any sense of the scope of people who were left behind in Korea or World War II or World War One?
Well, before Vietnam, we just left our missing. We have more than 72,000 missing men from World War II. We have more than 7,000 missing from the Korean War. We still have about 1,500 or so missing from the conflict in Southeast Asia. And you may read in local media or national media every month or so about a set of remains that are repatriated 50, 60, 75 years later. The families who receive these remains, whether they come from the Philippines or the South Pacific during one of our island campaigns in World War II, or Laos or Germany, these families are dumbfounded, absolutely dumbfounded that their father, grandfather, uncle is so many decades later being returned and repatriated. Again, that is one of the unheralded legacies of the Vietnam War, that a handful of wives in the 1960s spoke up about their missing and captive men and made the fate of the missing and captive men an absolute national priority. And families today are benefiting from their work.
Yeah, I'm eager to dig into that and particularly to learn more about how, what sparked this movement and how did it gain momentum and how did it become so, I mean, I hate to use the word institutionalized, but it sounds like it's the normal course of action for us now. But before we do that, I'd like to explore a little bit your personal connection to this topic.
Mm-hmm.
You and I are about the same age. Neither of us are old enough to have fought in Vietnam or to have been married to someone who fought in Vietnam. How did this particular story of military spouses become so important for you?
Well, I come from a Navy family. I'm third generation Navy. I served as a naval officer for 5 years. But as a child, I lived on the small island community of Coronado, California, um, part of San Diego County. And it is a tight knit military community even to this day. And I was living there in 1973 when our POWs were released from Vietnam. I was 6, and I have memories of the yellow ribbons and the homemade banners on the front porches. I grew up with some of the POW and MIA families. Those memories left an indelible mark on me. And then in 2000, I was a volunteer for the McCain for President campaign. And you may remember that many of his fellow POWs campaigned for him. And I was tasked with the assignment of taking some of them to media interviews. And I knew that they were some of the longest held POWs in our nation's history. But what I didn't know was how successful they were in captivity and also post captivity. But what struck me and kind of disappointed me about some of these interviews was that the reporters only seemed to be interested in their time in captivity. They would ask questions like, what were you fed? Were you tortured? Did your wife leave you? They never seemed to be interested in what happened to those men when those prison doors opened, when they got that second chance at freedom. And so that embarked me on a journey of finding out. And I wrote 2 books about them. And then about 8 years ago, one of them contacted me. His name is Captain Dick Stratton. He is a notorious, quite famous POW from the Vietnam War. He's close to 90 now. And he contacted me and he said, there's been so much written and documented about our epic battle in Vietnam, but much less has been written about the work and the fight that our wives engaged and waged on the home front. And I said, you're right. And so that embarked me on this journey of writing this book about the groundbreaking work that they did during the war and the legacy of their work that we're still living with today.
Now, you must have known women like that growing up, in the circumstances that you did. You must have known women who were dealing with, missing husbands or imprisoned husbands during that conflict.
I did. I was young. I was, 6 when they came home. So I definitely knew some of the families, but it really was much later that I heard a lot of these stories.
Mm. So at Dick Stratton's urging, you kind of dug into this topic with your partner, right? Your writing partner, your co-author.
Yes.
Where did you start? What was the first thing that you needed to do to get the project moving along?
Well, since I'd already written 2 books about our POWs, I had a pretty strong body of research and a lot of contacts. So I wanted to choose a cast of characters that represented a cross section of experiences. So Judy and I spent a full 2 to 3 years tracking down various POW and MIA wives to ensure that we had a really interesting mix of women with different experiences. Some are POW wives whose husbands came home. Some are MIA wives whose husbands' remains were never found. Some are MIA wives whose husbands' remains were recovered 10 years later, 20 years later. One character is a fiance, and fiancés in the military have no status. So unless you're actually married, you're not given any information. You're not given your husband's salary. Your fiance's salary. You have no status. So we wanted to see what her experience was like. We had some women who remarried, some who didn't. We had one woman who never, ever believed that her husband was dead and fed into the conspiracy theories that we left men behind in Vietnam and Laos, and she committed suicide in 1990.
Oh my.
We include Carol McCain, John McCain's first wife, who had a very unique experience during the war. Not only was her husband a POW and she had three young children, but she was in a devastating car accident in 1969, almost lost her leg, almost lost her life, and then almost lost her leg, and was severely, severely disabled and has been disabled for the rest of her life. We wanted to show a cross section of experiences, reactions, and activism, quite honestly. Some of the women became very active, and some of the women did not.
Hmm. Were there any of those? So once you sort of narrowed down the subjects, the lenses through which you wanted to explore this topic, right? Were there any surprises early on? Were there things that you thought you would find that just weren't there, or the other way around?
I think what surprised me was the number of restrictions that were placed on these women. Remember, this was the early 1960s when the social mores and values of the 1950s were still pretty much intact. It wasn't until the late 60s that you started seeing the roles of women really changing. So 1964, 65, when we started really engaging in Vietnam and had troops there and had missing men and POWs, women were still relegated to just a few professions: nurses, secretaries, teachers, flight attendants, or stewardesses, as they were called. And once they got married and had children, a lot of those jobs were not available to them. Women could not get a mortgage or a car without their husband's permission, without his signature or their father's. The birth control was available, but many doctors would not prescribe it to married women without their husband's permission. And some doctors wouldn't prescribe it to single women at all. For military women, or military wives, I'm sorry, the restrictions were even more stringent. These women had to abide by the protocols and the rules that their husbands lived under. So I had forgotten a lot of that. I really had forgotten a lot of that. I remember my mother, who was a Navy wife, reminding me that, you know, the Navy has always said if they didn't put it in your sea bag, they didn't want you to have it. And what she was saying is that the military doesn't issue you a wife or children. They issue you uniforms and they issue you weapons, but they don't issue you a family. So her point was that the military family was not a priority for the military until the Vietnam War. But I had really forgotten a lot of that. So if you think about that as the background for when we start losing men in Vietnam, and of course, my book focuses on not the ones who are being lost on the front lines, but the ones who are being lost, or who are missing, and those who are captured and held as POWs in North Vietnam. The military told these women, you must remain quiet. You must not talk to anyone about the plight of your husband. You should not talk to the media. You should not tell your neighbors. You should not tell anyone. And as one of them said to me, how do you live like that? How do you live like that?
You know, it makes me wonder if that was, I mean, is this, certainly you've heard this from the women that you've talked to. Have you seen, I mean, do you have any sort of documentation or first person? The reason I ask is, I've talked to Cindy Stonebreaker, whose father was missing. I've talked to a lot of people who had missing or POW fathers, and they all say the same thing, Taylor. They say we never talked about it. I never knew anybody else who had a dad who was missing in Vietnam until I was, 17 or 18. And that was the first time I realized, oh, there is someone I can talk to about it. But we never talked about it at home. We certainly didn't talk about it in public. That's almost a direct quote from Cindy Stonebreaker. And I always just thought that that was some sort of self-imposed silence. It sounds like it wasn't self-imposed.
No, it was policy. It was policy. Now, I can't speak for families not talking about it at home. I think some families did talk about it at home, but no, that was policy. Now, in the defense of the State Department and the Department of Defense, prior to Vietnam, during the Cold War, the military and the State Department, it was actually the State Department because they had the lead on this, on these negotiations, had successfully negotiated the release of American captives held behind enemy lines. Gary Powers is a good example. They had successfully done so during the Cold War through private, quiet, back channel diplomatic negotiations. And so when we had a few men captured in late 64, early 65, the State Department and the Johnson administration really had no reason to believe that that tactic would not work. And of course, who in 1964 and 1965 ever thought that the conflict in Vietnam would last as long as it did? So while we can criticize them now for that policy, initially they thought it made sense because it
Sure.
had worked before.
Mm-hmm.
But fast forward 3, 4 years later, we had now hundreds of men in captivity and thousands missing. And it appeared that the government was doing nothing. They were attempting to negotiate through back channel, and we know about the Paris Peace Accords, but the North Vietnamese were winning the battle of propaganda. I mean, they were using the anti-war activists who were their spokespeople saying, we've gone to visit these men in captivity. They're being treated well. We have no reason to disbelieve what the North Vietnamese are saying to us. Well, the women knew. They were being told by intelligence officials in the Pentagon, we have reason to believe that your men are being mistreated, that they are being tortured, that they're being put in solitary confinement. There were several wives, and one of them in our book, Sybil Stockdale, actually exchanged coded letters with her husband in captivity, where he revealed that there was widespread torture, there was widespread mistreatment, and there was solitary confinement for months on end. So the wives started questioning, why won't the government speak out about the abuses? Because it's in violations of the Geneva Conventions, and Vietnam was the signatory to the Geneva Conventions. She got so frustrated that she decided to go public herself. And she gave the first wife interview in October of 1968 to the San Diego Union. At this point, her husband had been in captivity for 3 years. She gave a lengthy interview to the San Diego Union, and it was at the time, I think it's still owned, I'm not sure. At the time, it was owned by Copley News Service, a syndicated news service. So I believe that article appeared not just in San Diego, but in newspapers around the country. That
And
opened that opened the floodgates.
yeah, and so people your age, my age, know who her husband is. But for listeners who might not be familiar with the name Stockdale, do you want to talk a little bit about him?
Sure. So Vice Admiral James Stockdale was a Navy commander at the time in 64. He was a carrier air group commander. So he was sort of at the top of his career. He was on track to make admiral. He was a well-respected aviator and a revered leader. And he and his wife had been married for 2 decades. They had 4 children. They were living in Coronado. Their house is now on the historic register because they lived there and owned it. And so he was one of the most senior POWs in captivity. And he earned the Medal of Honor while in captivity for actually his resistance efforts and his ability to get the torture to stop while in captivity. By virtue of his rank, his wife was also sort of the most senior wife. And back in those days, the wives wore the ranks of their husbands.
Oh, I remember. Yeah. I mean, my dad was an enlisted guy in the army, but I remember very well, even in the enlisted ranks, that, there was, you could tell, whose mother, as when I was a kid, you could tell whose mother was married to a corporal and whose mother was married to a
Right.
master sergeant.
Exactly.
Right. And it was just understood in the
Absolutely.
entire community that the behavior of a soldier's wife and children had an impact on his career.
And it reflected on him.
Yeah, it sure
Reflected
did.
on
It sure did.
absolutely. Yes.
So Mrs. Stockdale, being, sort of, I don't know how you would put it. I think you said senior. I'm assuming that has quotes around it. Among the wives of missing and POWs, decides to take a stand. Is that what started the avalanche?
That opened the floodgates for the women to get active. That
Mm.
was in the fall of 68.
Mm-hmm.
The government got behind the effort in May of 69. So when Nixon became president in January of 69, on the eve of his inauguration, Sybil Stockdale and her tribe of ladies, POW and MIA wives, deluged the White House with thousands of telegrams. She called it a telegram in, kind of a little
Yeah,
take on sit-ins that were really popular at the time.
yeah,
And the Nixon administration took notice. They really took notice. I found evidence in the Nixon library that they responded to each and every telegram and they said, wow, how many are there of these ladies? And Nixon's appointee for the role of Secretary of Defense was a man named Melvin Laird. Melvin Laird was a congressman from Wisconsin who became Secretary of Defense in January of 69. When he was in Congress, he had met with some of the wives who by this point were walking the halls of Congress, writing the media. I mean, they were doing anything they could, but they weren't getting a whole lot of traction with leadership. Melvin Laird took note and he said, I think these women and the plight of our missing and captive men in the Vietnam War, in this war, have become what he called the unmentionables. And he said, I think we need to put North Vietnam on report. I think they need to be tried in a court of public opinion. And so he tasked his staff with collecting all of the intelligence they could about the treatment of the men. And there was quite a lot that had just been sitting in file cabinets for years because the government's position up until 69 was we're not going to talk about this publicly. And so he had a press conference in May. He said, I'm gonna go public. State Department was not happy with him. The White House was not happy with him. Kissinger said, I really don't want you to do this. I think it's going to affect our negotiations in Paris. Melvin Laird said, by God, we're going to go public. And he held a press conference and he laid out all of the facts, all of the intelligence, pictures that his staff had collected, or those three-letter agencies had collected on the black market, that demonstrated how mistreated these men were. And that was the start of what became called the Go Public campaign. And the Nixon administration, with Melvin Laird as the point man, basically enlisted the women as their best advocates and best surrogates for this campaign. Nixon gave his silent majority speech in November of 69. I think he had these women in mind as his most important silent majority, and he was going to make sure that they were silent no more. And so this Go Public campaign was massive. It involved Ross Perot. It involved national media tours. These women were on television, all the national television shows in New York. Several of them went to Paris and sat down and had a meeting with the North Vietnamese Several of the women went around the world and met with world leaders, several of them, including the Pope. Several of them went up to New York and met with the United Nations. They met with the Teamsters unions. They went everywhere. But the best thing that they did that got traction with the national public were two things that they did. They worked with a campus organization to create these bracelets. I have one on now, which I know we're a podcast, so people can't see it. But a group of campus students created this wildly popular campaign of selling bracelets, little aluminum and copper cuffs that sold for a couple dollars a piece. And each one of them had the name of a captive or missing man. More than 5 million of them were sold. And for the first time, the issue of the missing and captive men became personal. People who thought women and men, women and men wore these bracelets, but I find more women wore them than men. All of a sudden, they kind of adopted this man as their own. And you still hear stories today of people who return the bracelet. They find out that their POW, came home and led a happy and successful life. And a woman will find this in her jewelry box and say, gosh, I want to return it to him. So you still hear about these reunions today. So that was the first thing they did that really galvanized the public. I mean, Frank Sinatra wore one of these bracelets. Sonny and Cher wore one of these bracelets. Ronald Reagan wore one of these bracelets. It was a wildly popular campaign. The second campaign they did that was very popular and enduring today is the POW and MIA flag. They wanted a symbol, a logo for their organization. They actually created a national organization called the National League of Families, which still exists today. And so they created this flag. Sadly, they didn't trademark it, so they never made any money on it. And of course, today, that flag, which flies over every federal building in the country and every post office, you can't drive 5 miles in this country without seeing one of those flags. That is a symbol of the leave no man behind policy that is really a priority for our country today, but it is a priority because the women made it so.
So this is astounding to me. First of all, I'm so excited that there's finally a history of this that I can read. I'm shocked that there hadn't been one prior to your book. But you've mentioned, Frank Sinatra and the Pope. Once I'm curious about the path from. I mean, once you expose the issue to light and oxygen, and it becomes part of the national consciousness, there's still a ways to go before it becomes policy, I would think.
Absolutely. And I would be remiss if I didn't mention, you said there's been no other books written about this, but there have been other books written about individual wives' experiences and a group biography about the National League of Families. So it's not that there hasn't been anything written about it. What's different about our book, in my opinion, is that we focus as much on the legacy of these women as we do what they did in the war. A full third of the book talks about the post-war efforts that these families, especially the MIA families, undertook to keep the fate of the missing men in the forefront of the public eye. And they will tell you, the women who are still involved in this organization, that the Ford and Carter campaign really did not pay much attention to the issue of our missing men. But when Reagan came into office in 1980, he made it a national priority. And I believe that is because he became engaged in the issue during the war. I told you he wore a bracelet. He wore Steve Hanson's bracelet, and his wife is in our book. And he became a tireless advocate for the POWs during the war and afterwards. And so the families, when they lobbied him, when he came into office, he made the fate of the missing an absolute priority. Unfortunately, during the 80s and the 90s, I don't know if you remember this, but there were all kinds of con men and charlatans who were preying on the families of the missing, promising them that they could go rescue their husband. You probably remember the movie Rambo.
I do.
Yes. Well, there was a real Rambo. In the movie, the Sylvester Stallone's character is based on a guy by the name of Lieutenant Colonel Bo Greitz. And he was a bona fide hero from the Vietnam War. Uh, but after the war, he became convinced that we left men behind alive, held against their will, and that the US government had covered this up. And he raised money from Clint Eastwood. He raised money from William Shatner. He raised money from MIA families, promising them that he could stage a private rescue attempt. He tried 3 times and, of course, never got very far. He ended up getting arrested. There were countless stories of some of these, what I call con men and charlatans, who took money from the MIA families and preyed on their vulnerabilities and their hope that they could find men still alive in captivity. It reached a crescendo in 1990 when a Senate Select Committee chaired by John McCain and John Kerry and Bob Smith, Senator Bob Smith from New Hampshire, held a 2-year investigation into the question of whether or not we still had men in captivity. A Wall Street Journal survey at the time in 1992 surveyed Americans. 3/4, 75%, said that they believed that we still had men held against their will in captivity. I mean, the controversy over this issue was intense and emotional. But that Senate Select Committee came to the conclusion that there was no credible evidence. And every investigation, there's been, I think, 5 or 6 investigations since the end of the war. No credible evidence has ever been proven and demonstrated that we left men behind.
Mm. You mentioned that one of the things that differentiates your book from other books on the same topic is that a lot of your book is a significant portion of your book is dedicated to the legacy of these women. Do you want to talk a little bit more about that? What do military wives today take for granted that that they actually have this group of women to thank?
Right. So it's interesting because, I mentioned that my mom said if the Navy didn't issue it to you in your sea bag, that, you weren't supposed to have it. She joked about it, but not really. After the war, when we experienced a drawdown after the Vietnam War, and we had, inflation was at an all-time high. You remember gas prices in the 70s. The military had a hard time retaining sailors and soldiers and airmen. And one of the retention issues that they identified was the unhappiness of military families, that they weren't given a priority, that there was no good childcare, that there wasn't good support network for the families when the service member deployed. So they decided to formalize military family policy and make it a priority. And the woman that they recruited to lead that policy was Alice Stratton. Alice Stratton's husband was Captain Dick Stratton, one of the most famous POWs in Vietnam. Alice was a career social worker who, by her own account, was shy and retiring. Social workers are, used to listening, not talking. And she was also very active in the campaign during the war. She continued to study military families after she got a master's, I believe, in military family policy, which I didn't know existed in the 70s, but it did. She got a master's in that. And she started getting noticed by the senior leadership in the military because of her knowledge of the needs of military families, and of course, because of her own experience. And she was appointed in 1985 to be the first Deputy Assistant Secretary of the Navy for Family matters, family policy, essentially. So she was the Secretary of the Navy's eyes and ears out in the fleet, helping him understand what families need. She was instrumental in establishing what's called the Navy's Family Service Centers. There's a family service center named after her. She was instrumental in recognizing the plight of single parents in the military. They had really been ignored uh, until then. She was really, really lauded for her work in the area of family policies, and I would I would say, in my opinion, that the work that women like Alice Stratton started in the Vietnam War, and of course continued until the mid 80s, really alerted and educated the military that if the service member's family is happy, the service member is going to be happy. And that the military family serves as much as the military service member does.
Yeah. Yeah. You mentioned a phrase at the top of our conversation that I just love. You said the unheralded legacy. We explore a wide range of topics on this podcast, but some of my favorites kind of fall into that bucket, right? The ways that American life today was shaped by the people of the Vietnam War era. So a lot of my enthusiasm for your book has to do with that. Has to do with what I think of as excuse me. A lot of my enthusiasm for your book has to do with the fact that it's kind of a bullseye thematically for this. It's a topic that I think is endlessly fascinating. Are there any other? What other things would you like our listeners to know about your book in terms of what they'll discover if they read it?
Well, we like to say that this is a nonfiction book because it's all true, but it reads like fiction. It reads like historical fiction, like a novel.
Hmm.
You will actually really, really get to know these characters who, like I said, had a variety of experiences, a variety of reactions. They're real women. They're real women. And we tried not to.
Pushing real women pushing real rocks up real hills.
Exactly. That's a great way of saying it. And, they really gave voice to the voiceless at the time.
Hmm. Mm-hmm.
And I think anyone who has an interest in, this sounds so cliche, women's empowerment stories would enjoy this. But we're also finding that men are enjoying it because it shows them, the epic home front battle that was going on while they were fighting in Vietnam.
Yeah. Yeah. I mean, most of the time when we have conversations with people about what was going on at home, it focuses on protests.
Right. Right. And think about the noise that these women had to rise above at home. They had the anti-war protests, they had Watergate, they had civil rights movements, they had, you know, cultural changes like
Sure. Just women's liberation and
women's
all sorts of
liberation.
things. Yeah.
Yeah, I mean, one of the POWs said to me, when I left for Vietnam, my wife had on long skirts and my son had short hair. When I came home, my wife was wearing mini skirts and my son had long hair. It was a shock to his system, an absolute shock to his system. So all of this was happening at home, and these women with very little tools in their toolbox except the ability to make phone calls on their landline, right? They had one phone in the house,
Mm-hmm.
which was attached to the wall
In the kitchen.
in the kitchen. And if you were lucky, it had a really long cord so that you could cook at the same time, pull it around the kitchen while you're cooking, and you put it on your shoulder, right?
Yeah.
That was one tool. The other tool they had was stationery and a pen to send letters. They didn't have, none of the tools that we have today when we are interested in mounting any sort of an advocacy or marketing or promotional campaign. And think about all of the din that they had, the cacophony of things that were going on that they had to rise above and actually, get a megaphone and be louder. And
Yeah.
they were successful at that.
Yeah,
They
it
were.
is. I'm so glad you brought that up. That hadn't occurred to me, but that is really astounding. Uh,
Absolutely.
the amount of sort of tumultuous national conversations that were happening at the
Right.
time, and like you said, with a pen and a paper and a telephone and some grit, they were able to rise above that, all of that noise, get the attention that
Right.
they needed,
Right.
drive policy change. Right? Not We're not talking about women who just drove awareness or public perception. We're talking about women who changed military policy.
Changed military policy and made the fate of literally 591 men an absolute national priority. I asked young people today, I was like, do you remember getting up in the middle of the night and watching the royal wedding on television? The royal wedding of William and Kate, or if you're the age you and I are, Michael, the
Charles and
wedding
Diana.
of Charles and Diana. I mean,
Yeah.
it was in the middle of the night, right?
Mm.
But people got up because they carried it live on television. The homecoming of our POWs in 1973 was just like that. The men landed first at Clark Air Base in the Philippines. It was the middle of the night in the United States. The networks carried it live. Millions of Americans got up to watch it in the middle of the night.
Mm.
Now, did they do that for the average Vietnam veteran coming home? No. They did that for the POWs because the women made their release so important, so important. It was a central negotiating factor at the Paris Peace Accords, and it deserved national live television coverage in the middle of the night. These men got a homecoming parades, a White House dinner, lifetime passes to Major League Baseball, national media tours, free cars. I mean, this is the fate of 591 men, a tiny, tiny, tiny fraction of the casualties of the 58,000 casualties and the, 2.1 million who served in Vietnam. Were they celebrated? No. This tiny, tiny fraction of men were celebrated because the women made them that important.
Yeah. And now the United States military deals with wives and families differently than it did
Absolutely.
before, and it deals with missing and POW. So it deals with the missing and the captured differently than it did before.
Absolutely. Absolutely.
That is amazing. Well, Taylor, you this has been such a treat for me. Thank you. What you said that the book is out today? Is that right?
It is out. It was released today. You can find
Today.
today. Yes, you can find your copy on Amazon or bookshop.org, Simon and Schuster. We have a website if you'd like to learn more about the book. It's unwaveringbook.com. That's UNWAVERING book.com. And the title again is Unwavering: The Wives Who Fought to Ensure No Man is Left Behind.